When studying military history, you often come across dogmas. You know the sort of thing. Well, situation A occurred because of event B, etc., etc. And you will hear this get repeated as fact when often it is a simplification of a much more complex situation than is generally appreciated by modern students of events. It is one of these events that I want to look at today. The sale by the British of Rolls-Royce Nene jet engines to the Soviet Union in 1946. So let's start by looking at this rather infamous story as often gets recited by modern tellers and see how it holds up to some investigation. And I should point out this was the story as I knew it before I dug into it a little bit. In 1946, the British, seemingly inexplicably, sold their latest jet engine, the Rolls-Royce Nene, to the Soviet Union, who was effectively their enemy. The Soviets quickly put a copy of the Nene into production, and this allowed them to rapidly field what was arguably the most formidable fighter aircraft in the world at the time, the Mickey Angurovich MiG-15. This jet would wreak havoc during the Korean War, being only matched by the F-86 Sabre in air combat. Indeed, the MiG-15 was far superior to the main British fighter of the day, the Gloucester Meteor, and the Brits had to ignominiously buy Sabres to enable the Royal Air Force to match the Soviets should war in Europe break out. So why would the British make such a crass mistake and sell the most advanced technology to the enemy of the West? Well, the Socialist Labour Party had just won the election in Britain the year before, and obviously they were a bunch of damn pinkos who wanted to help their ideological allies. But that didn't really do them any favours and led to Stalin's damning assessment of them. What fools would sell us their secrets? This sentiment has been echoed pretty much ever since, with the sale of the Nene jet engine being thought of as best abject stupidity, at worst out-and-out treason by those responsible. But what is the truth of the story? For starters, yes, the British sold Nenes, as well as earlier Derwent jet engines, to the Soviets, and that would ultimately be recognised as a mistake. However, hindsight is 2020, and the British government did have its reasons for selling the engines, which I will get to in due course. But to begin with, let's address the quote attributed to Stalin. You'll often hear that it was made by the Soviet dictator about the British after the sale. In fact, he made it to the Soviet Aviation Vice Minister, Alexander Yakovlev, when he proposed to Stalin that they should approach the British about potentially buying jet engines, as Stalin couldn't believe that the British would be so naive. Which probably tells you more about Stalin's attitude rather than any understanding he had about what the British were willing to sell and why. The reasons for the British wanting to sell their engines to the Soviets had very little to do with ideology. In fact, ideology could have been the factor that scuppered the deal, if anything. The new Prime Minister of Britain, Clement Attlee, was indeed a socialist. In fact, he was one of the most influential of Britain's Prime Ministers, creating the National Health Service for universal healthcare, the modern welfare state, and the British nuclear deterrent. Seems like a strange combination, I know. But Attlee was no communist sympathiser. In fact, in the words of Dr. Daniel Lomas, Attlee and many in his cabinet shared a long-held hatred of communists, something alluded to by MI5's Guy Little, who claimed rightly that Labour would be, quote, more interested, end quote, in MI5's information than their Conservative counterparts. Incidentally, Dr. Lomas has been on the channel talking about current intelligence issues in relation to China and Ukraine, which I will link to at the end, so be sure to check that out. Attlee would implement several intelligence operations aimed at the Soviet bloc, including what today would be termed of as kinetic ones. Unfortunately, most of these would end in failure and even tragedy, as British intelligence was thoroughly penetrated by Soviet agents at the time. But that is another story, and the long and the short of it is that Attlee was probably one of the least sympathetic prime ministers to ever deal with the Soviet Union. And while there are questions about the motivations of certain important figures on the decision to sell the Nenes to the Soviets, principally Stafford Cripps, head of the Board of Trade, it was Attlee who had ultimate say and gave the green light to the sale. His reasoning was both financial and political. At the end of the Second World War in 1945, Britain was beyond broke. Vast debts were owed to pay off the expenses of fighting the war, described by John Maynard Keynes, the preeminent economist of the day, as a financial Dunkirk. On top of that, Britain still needed to import supplies just to keep the country fed. Rationing, which had been introduced in 1940, would remain in place until 1954, and in July 1946, bread had to be rationed for the first time when the national wheat crop failed. This was obviously really not good and meant that Britain would have to increase grain imports or face starvation. And the Soviet Union was one of the primary wheat producers who could meet the need. So Attlee was faced with the problems of a financial crunch and keeping the country fed, which in turn meant keeping one of his major suppliers happy. As he wrote when deciding to allow the sale of the jet engines in September 1946, I can see no good reason for withholding the engines from the USSR, whereas their refusal will only cause trouble and suspicion. Because we also need to account for the diplomatic situation at that time between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Today, when talking about the period, we often just leap from the end of World War II into the Cold War, with the Soviet Union and the Anglo-Americans just immediately squaring up for possible conflict. But that actually took a couple of years to occur, and though both sides had their suspicions of each other, they had just fought together as allies, and in 1946 there were still hopes, certainly amongst the British, that a post-war détente could be maintained. After all, you had the new United Nations being established, which would allow the various opposing powers to find solutions to their issues without resorting to armed conflict. Plus, there was no real guarantee that the British could rely on the Americans. Relations in the immediate post-World War between the British and the Americans had some severe strains placed upon them, with the old colonial empire in decline and the United States happy to literally profit from the situation. For example, and as already stated, Britain critically needed financial support to just stay afloat. They had conducted negotiations with the US about receiving a long-term loan to prop them up while they repaired their shredded economy, and in December 1945 the Anglo-American Financial Agreement was reached. It proved extremely controversial. The British had, quite frankly somewhat naively, expected highly generous terms from the United States, considering the cost Britain had borne fighting the Axis. The Americans treated the whole affair as pretty much any other commercial deal. Now, I am no economic historian, and am happy to bow to the opinions of anyone who actually knows anything about the field, but the loan of $3.75 billion repayable over 50 years at a fixed interest of 2%, along with some trade and military concessions, seemed pretty fair to me. But for many in the British establishment, it was seen as getting screwed over by someone you considered a friend. However, Britain didn't have a choice and had to accept the deal. And if the bailout agreement caused controversy, what followed soon after created uproar. At the beginning of August 1946, President Truman signed into law the Atomic Energy Act. This forbade the sharing of atomic technology and secrets with foreign powers, and for the British, who considered the development of nuclear power to be very much a joint accomplishment, well, for many in the establishment, I think this was viewed as an out-and-out betrayal. Agreements had been made between Churchill and Roosevelt about the continued joint development of atomic energy in the Hyde Park Memorandum of 1944. But the Americans somehow managed to lose their copy.
Oh, how convenient!
Seriously, when the Brits complained about the Atomic Energy Act, the Americans told them they couldn't find their copy and therefore the agreement didn't exist. I mean, they found it again later after they amended the Atomic Energy Act so that they could share nuclear technology with the British. It was probably down the back of the couch or something. But jokes aside, this was a major problem for the British and looking like a bit of a trend. The United States, who had been seen by the British as the great hope for stabilising their national situation, seemed instead dead set on locking in their global supremacy at the expense of everyone else. I strongly suspect that, though Anglo-American relations were still considered strong, there were those in the British establishment who may well have considered the US to be a greater threat to British security and interests over the Soviet Union. Notably, the decision to allow the sale of the jet engines occurred just over a month after the passing of the Atomic Energy Act, so it is conceivable that the actions of the US smoothed some of the objections to the sale. Now, let's look at the accusations about the technological significance of the supplying of jet engines to Stalin. As said, It is basically a mantra that the Neen was the most advanced jet engine in the world, except it wasn't. Don't get me wrong, the Neen was a solid type, but it wasn't the cutting edge as often gets portrayed. The Neen was a centrifugal compressor design that was already recognised as of limited potential, and even in 1946 the British were working on far more advanced designs that would prove the future of jet development, the most notable being what became the Rolls-Royce Avon. Indeed, the British never really bothered using the Neen in a fighter, instead fitting it in attack aircraft like the Supermarine Attacker and the Hawker Seahawk. What the British did with the Neen was sell it. The engine was made under license in the United States, Australia, Canada, and France. There were apparently even discussions at one point of helping Argentina to set up a factory to build it. To be frank, the Neen was not some super secret project. It was a commercial product that was available to anyone who could afford it and was openly marketed in the aviation press as such. In fact, the original story about Stalin's scathing reply to Yakovlev about the idea of buying engines from the British actually concluded with Yakovlev explaining that the British were not just willing to sell, they were aggressively advertising the fact. So that leaves the final question. What went wrong? How did the Rolls-Royce Neen, a decent enough engine but nothing particularly noteworthy, end up being used in arguably the best fighter of its day? Well, here the British definitely screwed up. They badly underestimated the capacity of the Soviet era industry to produce a copy of the Neen and the lessons that they would be able to learn from it. As already said, most of the design elements of the Neen were what today we would refer to as open source. The engine's design was known in scientific and commercial publications as well as its basic design parameters. But the British were confident that the Soviets wouldn't be able to replicate the metallurgy of the most critical components in the engine, most especially the turbine blades, which were made of advanced pneumonic alloy, and it was assumed beyond the Soviets' ability to copy. As a further note on this, and little remembered, was that the Soviets also requested to purchase 3 Gloster Meteors and 3 de Havilland Vampire jet fighters at the same time as they were requesting the Neen and Derwent engines. But this was turned down because the British suspected that the Soviets wanted to copy these designs and so refused their export. As it was, Soviet aerodynamic research was far more advanced even than the British, mainly thanks to the captured German scientists who were now employed by the Soviet aircraft manufacturers, and it seems unlikely that the Soviets would have learned anything of use from either the Meteor or the Vampire. But to return to the Neen, it seems that the British didn't have any qualms over the Soviets being able to copy them, and that was their mistake. In fact, the illegal copies of both the Derwent and the Neen that the Soviets produced did have huge problems in finding suitable alternative materials for construction. But the Soviets, obviously even more concerned by the American monopoly on atomic weapons than the British, really pulled out all the stops to resolve the issues as a national priority, so that they could get high-performance jet aircraft into the air as soon as possible. The purchase of the Neens was indeed a boon for development of what became the MiG-15, as the first prototypes were able to fly with Rolls-Royce built engines, which, as a fully developed power plant of excellent manufacture, allowed the Soviets to assess the qualities of the new aircraft with minimal concerns over engine failure during the test program, a factor that has delayed and even killed plenty of potentially good aircraft throughout history. And there can be no denying that being able to study the Neens helped the Soviets appreciate the possibilities of the design and encouraged them along, especially as they were already working on a copy. According to aviation historian Jacob Whitfield, the Klimov VK-1, which powered the formidable MiG-15 BIS model that caused so many problems over Korea, was in fact in development even before the Neens became available for study. It is generally recorded in text that the VK-1 was a direct copy of the Neen and then improved upon it to make it more powerful. But that apparently isn't quite correct, and Klimov was designing a Neen knockoff designed to Soviet specifications and material standards based off openly available marketing material and scientific papers before he even got to see a Neen in real life. As a result, the VK-1, the principal engine used in the MiG-15, proved far better than the illegally copied version of the Neen, the RD-45, because it was built from materials available and understood to the Soviets from the beginning, whereas the RD-45 always had issues from the Soviets being unable to match the British materials. Now, as said, actually having a Neen to study firsthand must have helped Klimov along tremendously, but the standard mantra of the Soviets copied the Neen is, like most of the generally accepted so-called facts of this episode, far too simplistic and, quite frankly, a disservice to the capabilities and intelligence of the Soviet engineers of the time. And yes, I am aware of the story of the Rolls-Royce executive coming across VK1s being made in Chinese factories and throwing a fit, subsequently followed by Rolls-Royce trying to sue the Soviets for illegally copying the Neen. But seeing as the Americans had long before this captured MiG-15s in Korea and had meticulously stripped them down for analysis, the idea that Rolls-Royce didn't know that the Neen had inspired the VK1 before that point seems unlikely. So there we have it. It is easy to look back with hindsight and criticise past choices when being fully aware of the consequences, but that is to detract from our understanding of those decisions and the reasons for them. The sale of jet engines to the Soviets was far from either some Machiavellian commie plot or based on abject stupidity. It was a logical commercial decision to sell an internationally known and actively marketed commodity to a nation that was still considered at that time to not be a serious military threat and who was a critical trading partner. Moreover, it was hoped that selling such technology would provide a sign of good faith to the Soviets, especially as concerns over US atomic dominance were so prevalent, and help smooth future relations. If things had worked out differently, perhaps the sale of the Neens could have been a watershed moment in East-West relations by helping to assuage the growing suspicions and concerns between the two sides. But that didn't happen. In fact, the British were guilty of several mistakes. Firstly, they badly underestimated the capabilities and intentions of those who would become their enemy, both critical factors in the decision to sell jet engines to the Soviets. But they also had an optimistic outlook on the possibilities for peace in the immediate post-war period, which was compounded by the criticality of their own situation. The old saying is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And in this case, those good intentions would be paid for in the skies over Korea 4 years later. Hope you enjoyed this video. I certainly enjoyed researching and writing it. If you like this sort of history, be sure to check out the links popping up right now, and don't forget to like, subscribe and comment. It's all good for the channel, and I'm interested to see what everyone has to say. Have a good one, everyone. Catch you next time.